Hello. Hi, and welcome. I'm Cora Fox, and I'm the Associate Professor of English and the coordinator of the Health Humanities Initiative at the Institute for Humanities Research. And I have the pleasure of being your host for this 4-part series of webinars on the histories and cultures of epidemics. I'd like to thank especially our invited guest, Priscilla Wald, for presenting her work on narratives of contagion today, and for being willing to translate that work for a wider public audience. In doing so, scholars take on a leadership role in a crisis that has revealed the vital ways in which health depends on culture as much as it does on science and technology. The pandemic has also highlighted the injustices and inequities that are built into structures of care in the United States and elsewhere, and I hope this research into the cultures of health can help us move forward into the post-pandemic era, ready to build better systems that offer access to care for all. So before we get started, I'd like to thank the many behind-the-scenes staff members who are making all of this work, especially Liz Grombach, Lauren Whitby, Barbara Dente, and Selena Osuna, and the Institute for Humanities Research and Ron Brolio for funding these events. I also owe a great debt to Marlon Bailey, who's serving as co-host for this event. Marlon is Associate Professor of Women and Gender Studies in the School of Social Transformation at ASU. He has served as the Benedict Distinguished Visiting Professor in Africana Studies at Carleton College, the Distinguished Weinberg Fellow in the Department of African American Studies at Northwestern, and a visiting professor at the Center for AIDS Prevention Studies at the University of California, San Francisco. He currently serves on the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine's Committee on Understanding the Status and Well-Being of Sexual and Gender Diverse Populations. He has been an active faculty member of our Health Humanities Initiative and is on the board of Creative Health Collaborations at ASU. So in just a minute, I'm going to turn it over to Marlon to introduce our distinguished guest. But first, I wanted to give an overview of what to expect for this webinar. First, Dr. Wald will offer a short presentation on her research, followed by a Q&A discussion with Professor Bailey, and then in the last 10 minutes or so, we will open it up for questions or comments from those who are present with us. So you can use the Q&A feature throughout, and I will try to introduce as many of those questions as I can at the end to Dr. Wald. So, okay, so thank you, I guess that's it. Thank you for joining us. And now if I can get the technology right, I will turn it over to Professor Bailey. Okay.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Dr. Fox, for that introduction and overview. And welcome, Dr. Wald. It is a pleasure to have you here and to lead this very important discussion. I want to say a few things about what we're talking about today and to put Dr. Wald's presentation and presence here into context. The title of Dr. Wald's presentation is Contagion, COVID-19, the Outbreak Narrative, and Why We Need to Change the Story. These are perilous times. We are in the time of the COVID-19 pandemic, which is ravaging our society and disproportionately infecting and killing Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities, the elderly, individuals with chronic illnesses, and communities living in poverty. This is what Meryl Singer would call a time of syndemics, or the overlapping and intersecting pandemics fueled by health disparities caused by poverty, stress, and structural violence, particularly during this time, white supremacist, racist, state violence against people of color. Our discussion today allows us to engage in a humanistic inquiry with Professor Wald about the power of narrativity and about the past to help us better understand what is happening today and how to move forward toward a different future. we should think about how we can foster strategies and networks of care in this moment in which there is so much skepticism and distrust of public health. Those of us impacted by COVID-19 cannot rely on public health right now. The CDC and FDA are being politicized and manipulated by this administration, which has demonstrated no fidelity to science at all. So we are in trouble. But the humanities can help us imagine and chart a different course. Professor Priscilla Wald is the R. Florence Brinkley Professor of English and Professor of Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies at Duke University. Dr. Wald has an extensive publication and teaching record, which I can't rehearse here, but I'd like to highlight her book, Contagious, Cultures, Carriers, and Outbreak Narrative, published by Duke University Press in 2008, and Constituting Americans, Cultural Anxiety and Narrative Form, also published by Duke University Press in 1995. And Dr. Wald is currently working on a monograph entitled Human Being After Genocide. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Priscilla Wald.
Thank you for the introduction and the invitation, and thank you all for being here. I'm just going to take a moment to share my screen. Oops. Sorry, a little technical difficulty. Getting a little preview. Okay, here we are. So 25 years ago, when I started this research, I really didn't expect to be living my work in quite this way. And in 2008, when my book came out, I also didn't expect to be quite, again, living my work, nor did I expect that in 2015 when I presented some of this work at a conference at ASU. I should have. I certainly had read the science. I had been apprised of the coming plague, as Laurie Garrett titles it. I had, in fact, had dinner with a group of friends or colleagues when we were working on a project on this, on pandemics together, one of whom was involved in a national pandemic response initiative. And he said at this dinner that at the first sign of a couple of cases, or more than a couple, more than a handful of cases of avian flu, he was going to take his family and move to his cabin in the wilderness of the North Carolina mountains. And I said, really, that bad? And he said, worse. So I really should have been prepared. Intellectually, I was. Emotionally, I was not. And I think one of the ironies is that part of the reason I was not prepared was, in fact, the outbreak narrative. And we are all susceptible. Even though I have studied this, identified it, talked about it ad infinitum, I still fell victim to the outbreak narrative. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is, what is this outbreak narrative? What are the consequences of this story, and why and how should we change it? So the outbreak narrative is a conventional story that we tell about catastrophic communicable diseases, outbreaks of those diseases that potentially become pandemics, or as we're living it, in fact, become pandemics. And it began with or at least my version of it begins with a 1989 meeting in Washington, D.C. After a decade in which HIV had made its rounds around the world. And the 1970s was a time of a lot of sanguinity about communicable disease. People working in the field, especially after the eradication of naturally occurring smallpox in the late 70s, really thought that communicable disease as a real threat was going to be a thing of the past. It was going to be an annoyance rather than a genuine threat to humanity. But all that while, emerging infections, or what became known as emerging viruses, catastrophic communicable diseases, hemorrhagic fevers like Ebola, Marburg, Bolivian hemorrhagic fever, Nipah virus, all of these really terrifying things were popping up at remote locations around the world. And there wasn't a lot of attention paid to them, even in the scientific community, a little bit, but not a lot. until HIV became something people could not ignore. And at the end of that decade, a group of professionals in the field got together for this meeting, and they decided that all of these novel viruses, all of these novel diseases were the consequence of globalization and development patterns. They were all part of one phenomenon that they called disease emergence or emerging infections. And that idea began to circulate widely. And they said, as I noted, it was the consequence of globalization, development patterns. The population was growing. People were inhabiting areas of the world that human beings hadn't lived before, and encountering microbes to which there was no human immunity. So we were immunologically naive and therefore susceptible. That's exactly what has happened with the coronavirus, right? That the microbe SARS-CoV-2 got into the human population, there's no immunity, and it really circulated widely. The other part of globalization development patterns was that as the population was growing, the world itself was shrinking. That is, we were improving transportation and our economies were increasingly tied together, and we were increasingly rapidly moving people and goods around the globe. And these two things together, going into these new areas and having them more and more interconnected, rapid movement around the globe, these are the conditions that create outbreaks and cause outbreaks to become pandemics. And they said, we can't just address this with medical science. We have to see this as social, economic, and geopolitical problems, as well as medical and scientific. And we really have to change our behaviors. We have to think more about how we're practicing globalization and development. We have to change those practices on a large scale, and we also have to change our behavior on a small scale. So that was the analysis that they tried to get out. And what I study is how that information moved from science into scientific journalism, mainstream journalism, and eventually popular fiction and film, and how certain images and narratives, storylines, and vocabulary became conventional and formed this story that I call the outbreak narrative. I want to say from the outset, the outbreak narrative isn't all bad. I'm not just going to say this is an evil story. It's a technology. It allowed epidemiologists very quickly to identify a problem and figure out how to respond to it. But like any technology, it also obscured, it became so conventional that there were certain things we couldn't see. And it obscured certain features of this story that I'm going to address today and talk about the need for change. So I want to start with a quick film clip. And this is the opening scene of the film Outbreak from 1995, Wolfgang Petersen. And this film was one of the things that really put the concept of an outbreak and the outbreak narrative into widespread circulation. So I'm going to move us quickly in the interest of time. I just want to pause for a moment on Joshua Lederberg's little epigram. The single biggest threat to man's continued dominance on the planet is the virus. So this is how this film begins. And I will start us here.
Quelque chose de la morphine.
Men wounded in battle we can deal with. But this strange disease. 30 men dead yesterday. 18 the day before. We need supplies. Plasma, penicillin.
We'll get you everything you need, Doctor.
You're Americans. Please, get me out of this shithole.
Hey, buddy, that's what we're here for. We're gonna take you home. But first, we're gonna take a little blood sample, all right?
I'm gonna die, right?
No, you're not gonna die.
Tell my girl I love her.
I'm not gonna tell her. You're gonna tell her yourself, all right?
The soldiers inside are in the early stages of the disease. By tomorrow night, they will look like this.
Mother God. I'll authorize an immediate airdrop, Doctor. It's even worse than I thought. Get the plane here by 1900 hours. Well, shouldn't we at least... Get the plane, Billy.
Is the Outbreak Narrative, or at least the beginning. And I like this film, well, sort of like this film, for the reason that it really does illustrate perfectly the conventions of the Outbreak Narrative. So first of all, there is a kind of geography of disease where the threat moves from the global south to the global north, which of course is historically not accurate, but there we are. Expertise moves in the opposite direction. Uh-oh, hang on, sorry. There we go. And I love this particular moment in the film because the doctor from Zaire comes out and he says, you know, these people were in the first stages of the disease. After a day or two, they're going to look like this. He begins to lift the tarp and we expect to see something horrible. And the camera does a 180 and we're looking at this awful image through the visor of Donald Sutherland, right? He's the expert who's going to mediate this problem for us. We will look at it through his eyes. And so that is setting up a kind of expertise. And of course, Donald Sutherland decides that this threat is terrible. These men, as he tells Morgan Freeman, are casualties of war, the people in the mercenary camp, and we have to sacrifice them for the good of everyone, so he contains the threat. The film will end with, the premise of the film, the meat of the film, takes place in the more contemporary moment, 1995, in a Northern California town that is also experiencing this horrible disease. Donald Sutherland again wants to nuke the town. People say, but these are Americans, sir, not casualties of war. And Dustin Hoffman steps in and saves the day as a medical scientist by coming up with a cure and containing the disease very implausibly. So it's a really terrific film to illustrate this point of the outbreak narrative. And it also tells us that who is and who is not expendable as casualties of war. So that's a big part of it as well. So what I'm going to do for the rest of this talk is just go very quickly through some of the other features of the outbreak narrative and talk about why it's so appealing and what some of its consequences are. So I've talked about how it's apocalyptic and there's a kind of interdependence and the geography of disease. Part of the geography of disease is that the microbes also are border crossers. So very readily identified with kind of illegal immigration and other terrorism and other things of that sort, but also stressing the danger of our interconnection, right? That globalization is threatening us because we're all in so much contact. And the sensational version by Richard Preston, a lot of my students think of it as a novel because it's so sensational, it's actually journalism, talks about once a virus hits the network of airline routes, it can shoot anywhere in a day, Paris, Tokyo, New York, LA, wherever planes fly. I'm not going to read the Laurie Garrett quotation at the end, and The Coming Plague is a terrific book. She's a very responsible journalist. She's the one who really talks about the 1989 conference and tries to get that message across. But I just want to look at that opening image of the Andromeda strain, which of course is from a Michael Crichton 1969 novel that takes place in the US Southwest, and it's a terrible disease that kills everyone, all but 2 people in this town. Everybody's afraid that this is going to be a species-threatening event. And it's amazing how often medical professionals talking about this issue, especially in the 90s and early 2000s, referred to this Andromeda strain. Like Laurie Garrett, when they refer to it, it's almost entirely something that surfaces in Africa. And again, this notion of megacities arising in the developing world, creating niches from which virtually anything might arise. And even though hantavirus is another one of these viruses, and there was a hantavirus outbreak in the southwestern US, exactly where you are in ASU, but also exactly where the Andromeda strain takes place. And yet nobody talks about the Andromeda strain in reference to the hantavirus outbreak. And for British scientists, it's often in Asia. So I just want to emphasize the ways in which our stigmas find their way into these narratives. Okay, one of the most important metaphors that comes out of, or figures that comes out of these stories, whether it's in the science or in the journalism or the fiction, is this notion of how we are at war with our microbes. The microbes are the enemy. Scientists seem not to be able to resist, again in the 90s and early 2000s when I was doing this work, but I've seen it again now, of a notion of microbial warfare. And if I say to scientists, have you thought about that metaphor and what that metaphor assumes, they'll say, it's just a metaphor, don't make a big deal out of it. But if you talk to anyone who does discourse analysis or cognitive linguistics or sociolinguistics, they tell us that the words that we use, our vocabulary, our grammatical constructions, our metaphors, all tell us a lot about the fundamental assumptions that we hold that we're not even aware of. And one of the things I love about popular fiction and film, especially the really absurd versions, the science fiction horror that I delight in reading, and there's a lot of it on this topic, including zombie novels and all of that, that what they do is they take things like a metaphor like microbial warfare from the science or from the journalism, and they dramatize it in extended scenarios where we are literally at war with our microbes. Microbes that take on human traits, microbes that take over human bodies, microbes that, in some cases, eco-terrorists that are using the microbes to sow these outbreaks in order to rid the planet Earth of the virus of humanity. So this is a classic idea. And these notions come originally from the science, and the reason they're so important, among other things, is that the message that the scientists were trying to get across, that we have to change our behavior, that it's human beings that are creating these conditions, is really obscured when we think about the virus as being cunning, as having its own, as being an enemy, as wanting to hurt humanity in some way. And if you look at the Krauss quotation, the second paragraph in red, and he's one of the scientists that was involved in this meeting, he talks about microbes as not idle bystanders, as more than simple opportunists, as having been great innovators. And again, cunning is a word that gets used a lot. So I think these are important things to keep in mind. How did we undermine our that narrative that the 1989 meeting was trying to get across, that Laurie Garrett's trying to get across, that a lot of us are trying to get across? Another problem with this human being versus microbe is evident in the top quotation here by the very responsible science journalist, Barbara Culleton. Again, I'm not talking about people sensationalizing. I'm really talking about very responsible scientists that are trying to get a different message across, but that cloud what they're trying to say by the language that they use. And Barbara Culleton refers to soul virus, again, how we name these things by where they're first identified and what happens as a result of that. Wuhan virus, Kung flu, China virus, we heard our president talking about all of that. So Barbara Culleton refers to soul virus as another unwelcome immigrant, a cousin of Asian Hantan virus, which causes hemorrhagic fever. So you see how easy it is for people to hear this and jump to demonizing people who are from the place that the virus is named after. And we saw this in the US and elsewhere at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, where literally Asian Americans and Asians in America were getting beat up on the streets because of coronavirus, and not just in America, but elsewhere as well. So this is, again, one of the dangers that the outbreak narrative can stigmatize, or does stigmatize, certain places, peoples, and behaviors. It's very easy, once we've animated the microbe, to give it a kind of otherworldly mystique, right? This isn't just the Cold War, say, between US and Russians, or the new Cold War between the US and Russia. But there's something otherworldly about this microbe, and even fascinating about it. And this is part, to me, of the appeal of the outbreak narrative, that there's a kind of mysticism about it, and even a mythic quality. And one of the things that happens is, again, you can see it most clearly in the science fiction horror novels about the outbreaks. And that is that there's a kind of apocalyptic battle between epidemiologists and scientists on the one hand, and these mythic microbes, these otherworldly microbes on the other, over the fate of humanity. And I think, we all need our myths. I think these mythic stories, this story appeals as a detective narrative. How did this happen? It appeals as an action narrative, but it also, I think, has this mythic quality. Chuck Hogan's The Blood Artist is a great example of this, and it's literally the figure I'm talking about, a human being that a virus takes over and slowly, doesn't kill him, but slowly takes him over, and he begins seeding these outbreaks, again, to rid humanity, to rid the planet of the virus of humanity. And the story is about two CDC researchers who are trying to find and trap this figure. And I'll read the second paragraph here. The threat of a mutant virus gifted with human intellect and cunning posed hazards exceeding Merrick, one of the researchers' worst imaginings, but all he envisioned was its one great advantage. Epidemic control had never been simpler. Zero, patient zero, their name for this figure, was like a tumor Merrick could go in and surgically remove. And as you see, this is exactly what the message was trying to avoid. They were trying to say, don't wait for scientific medicine to solve it. We have to make changes now. We can't afford to wait. We're not going to be able to do it. And yet all of the stories of the outbreak narrative are tales of closure. They're always about how medical science saves the day. Here's a journalistic version of it, a little more sedate. And this is from the last SARS pandemic. This is from a special issue of Newsweek from 2003 on the pandemic, on SARS. And these were effacing pages linked by the caption, "Fear of SARS prompts a Lufthansa crew to wear masks in the Hong Kong airport. The virus may have been born on a farm like the one above in Guangzhou, China, where animals and people live close together." And I won't read it, but the whole paragraph, but the article talks about how novel coronaviruses are delivered by China, and there people live cheek by jowl on the district's primitive farms as though they're time travelers who are bringing these old plague-ridden practices to the modern world. And the danger is that Guangzhou is a teeming city that mixes people, animals, and microbes from the countryside with travelers from around the world. Now, what's wrong with this story? Once again, the problem is traveling from global south to global north. Expertise, according to this article, travels in the other direction. These are people who are bringing these time, plague-ridden time traveling to the modern world, rather than what it really is these are not people who don't know better and who are bringing these old practices to the modern world. Rather, this is an image of poverty. These are people who can't afford not to live in proximity to their animals. And so the problem is not a problem for medical science to solve, which is what the whole issue is about. Bravo us, we solved the problem. But rather, we need to address the problems of poverty. We need to address the global inequities that cause the conditions that allow outbreaks to happen and that encourage outbreaks to become pandemics. These are social problems, they're economic problems, they're geopolitical problems. They cannot be left for medical science. So how can we tell the story differently? Very quickly, I just love the fact that Joshua Lederberg, our immunologist, says one of the major things we have to do is change our metaphor. he said this in 2000, stop talking about warfare, stop doing a good and evil, and really think about the complexity, the ecological complexity of how we live all the time with our microbes, good and bad, and how we can live more effectively with our microbes, working cooperatively with the good ones and keeping the bad ones at bay. Well, I'm now using good and bad. See, I get caught in the outbreak narrative. But what I really want to talk about by way of conclusion is a bigger way of changing the story. I don't think, well, I think I know, it's not a coincidence that Black Lives Matter and the Black Lives Matter analysis has grown exponentially and gone really global during this pandemic. And that's in part because the pandemic has illustrated the inequities. They've illustrated, as Marlon was saying, that Black, Brown, and Indigenous people are more susceptible and more likely have much higher disproportionate mortality and morbidity rates. And that's not biology, that is because of the global inequity or the inequities of racism, the structural inequities of racism that's built into our system. That has to do with access to healthcare. Environmental justice tells us that has to do with the unhealthy conditions that certain populations are inequitably forced to live in. And the Black Lives Matter analysis says if we begin by addressing the problem of anti-Black violence, whether it's violence by police or the structural violence of these inequities, we will gradually and pretty quickly begin to address inequities much more broadly for the society at large. And that includes the conditions that I've been talking about that predispose to pandemics. That includes the environmental issues, it includes the access to healthcare and education, and all of the things that Black Lives Matter is talking about. So how do we retell, or how will we tell the story of COVID-19? We could tell it as a story of medical science versus enemy microbes, doing mythic battle for the fate of humanity. We might look back and say, well, you know, depending on what happens, we were able to mobilize our resources and we quarantined and we created a vaccine and we came up with pharmaceuticals, not nearly quickly enough, let me add. Let's hope we don't look back and tell that story. Or we can tell the Black Lives Matter story of human beings acknowledging social responsibility for the world in which we all live together. The outbreak narrative is a story of crisis and survival. And yes, when you're in the middle of a pandemic, of course, our resources should be going to vaccines, pharmaceuticals, and quarantine. But I hope when we look back on this, we can tell the story, or we can address this by how we want to live more responsibly and equitably in a global world. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Oh my God, that was magnificent and so relevant. Oh. So I've got a couple of questions that I want to ask, and then in the interest of time, I want to make sure that our guests have an opportunity to ask a couple of questions as well. The question I have is kind of two-part. Oh, I need to start my video. Sorry. Oops.
Yeah.
You were hearing this voice emerging from the name. So one question is, what areas of humanities research do you see as emergent or essential in this moment shaped by the pandemic? And the second part of that question really speaks to what's going through my mind while you did your presentation, is can we imagine a world where the humanities scholar is at the table with the epidemiologist, with the biomedical practitioner, with the doctor, the medical doctor, on the same committee, on the same table, in the same room, grappling with this pandemic?
I think we're maybe not at the table as much as I would wish, but we are at the table. So even in the 1989 meeting I was talking about, William McNeill, who is a historian, was at that table. And so there have been voices, they're not dominant ones. And I think we have a lot of work to do to get people to see that the humanities is really central to these analyses. But I'm finding, as I've done, and I've been given a seat at the table at Duke University over my couple of decades here. I've worked very closely. I mentioned the guy who was going to flee to his house in the North Carolina mountains. And, you know, I was part of conversations about infectious disease and panels with people who were like this guy who was working at the national level, and also with geneticists. There was it's no longer here, but an Institute for Genome Sciences and Policy run by someone named Hunt Willard, and you have at ASU a faculty member named Robert Cook-Deegan who ran a Center for Genome Ethics, Law and Policy, and they invited me right in. They were crucial to my being able to do this work and to be heard for doing this work. So you have somebody there who really is eager to work with you. To get back to your question about what areas, two that I would mention off the top of my head are health humanities, obviously, you guys already know about, so I won't go on there, but environmental humanities and specifically people working in the area of environmental justice. And I also think finally critical race theory. You absolutely need to have critical race theorists, people who really understand what structural racism is as part of this conversation, because honestly, you know, where I concluded, I think the best way to start addressing these issues is not to address the pandemic and racism as part of that, but to address structural racism and the violence of structural racism. And that will lead us to, I think I was rushing through this, it will lead us to the things we need to change in order to keep outbreaks from happening, or in order, if they happen, to keep them from becoming pandemics. And that's healthcare, education, the environment in all of its manifestations, climate change, environmental resources, all of it. It really, to me, begins by addressing structural racism.
I'm so glad you said that, because I do work on HIV, and that is also the case with HIV. And so then the last question I have for you before we go to the rest of the participants. So this is also about training. It's about how do we train our practitioners, our scientists, our scholars who are concerned about using their skills to solve social problems. How then, for you, how has this work shaped your teaching? How has this pandemic shaped your teaching and how you train your students?
Well, the pandemic, I wasn't teaching in the spring, and the pandemic, we've just started teaching at Duke, and the pandemic has shaped I'll get back to what I'm learning, but it shaped my teaching by having to figure out how to teach online, and boy, am I learning on the job, as you can probably see.
Yeah.
But let me go to the other question first, because I think ASU has been pioneering this, and that is, how do we train people? I think through interdisciplinarity. And I don't even want to call it interdisciplinarity, because what I see happening, and ASU has been one of the places really pioneering this, University of Washington, Bothell campus also. And that is, I really see our disciplines changing. And I think new formations are emerging. I see students really eager to take classes that will talk about environmental policy, but also talk about narratives and using literature to understand how nature and our ideas about nature are changing and what that means, how our notions of the human are changing. I do a lot of co-teaching. I'm teaching a class right now with our campus farmer, who is fantastic, Saskia Corns, and a soil chemist in the Nicholas School, Dan Richter. This is our third time teaching class, first time online. And we're teaching it partly in the field and partly online. So I'm looking forward to being in the field, let me tell you. And, you know, I couldn't address these issues without them, because they bring things that I don't know. I mentioned Robert Cook-Deegan. He and I used to team teach classes all the time, because we brought things that the other one didn't know. And we each grappled with the same material. It wasn't that I taught the literature and he taught the legal and medical texts. What we did was we had students see how a literary scholar would approach legal and scientific texts, and how a MD policy person would approach literary and cinematic works. And that was really important to have that conversation really cross-pollinating.
Yes, I was fortunate enough to participate in the Health and Humanities lab at ASU, and I taught a Health and Humanities class, and it was team taught with a colleague of mine in religious studies, and we had a similar experience grappling with health issues and epidemics, pandemics, through narrative, history, through literature, through poetry. So it was very inspiring for me and important to my own work. All right, we've got
this generation understands that. Right?
Yes.
This generation knows that that the questions that are motivating them are not fitting the disciplines neatly.
Absolutely, absolutely. We've got some questions. Oh, we've got a lot of questions waiting for you. Dr. Fox.
Hi.
Hi.
Should I introduce some of these questions into the mix? Okay, we had a question about the villainization of masks during COVID-19 and the mask wearers. Could you maybe address that a little bit as also possibly relating to the narrative?
Sure, absolutely. I don't have anything profound to say because it was so out in the open. Our president was making it a political issue. His allies were making it a political issue. And it's unbelievable to me that we're playing Russian roulette with people's health by making wearing a mask a political issue. Other cultures just know to do this. And, you know, I do think that the outbreak narrative that I outline is largely a US based narrative. And as people have said on in news shows that have talked about this, Americans don't want to be told what to do. But as other commentators, and so that is part of the outbreak narrative, is the individualism and what have you. But as the other commentators, again, on the media have said, is, well, we wear seatbelts, we wear helmets. I mean, there are people who object to that. There are probably people who don't do it, but you know, bicycle helmets and motorcycle helmets, I see people not doing it, but nobody's making a huge political statement about it. And so, yeah, I think that almost analyzes itself. I don't have a deep, profound thing to say. It's shocking.
Along the same lines, I think we had someone who asked about, along the same lines of kind of analyzing the symbolism of this particular outbreak. They wanted to know about what you think about the idolization of Dr. Fauci. And then a follow-up question to that was, could you have a humanist in that role as the kind of idealized heroic figure?
That's a great
Wow.
question. And Fauci, of course, was known to those of us who lived through the HIV pandemic. He had a much different role in that pandemic. And one of the things I will say, and this isn't really the question, but that I admire Fauci for, is how he learned during that pandemic. You know, and there are films about this where the interactions with ACT UP and his learning to communicate better, his learning to explain why they were hesitating. This, for people who didn't know, this was, ACT UP was very frustrated because Fauci was saying, you know, we can't just give you medicine that might work, that the newest idea that someone has, because we don't know the effect of this on you or people surrounding you. I mean, these things mess with your system and could create all kinds of worse problems. And he didn't really understand how to communicate that effectively. And over time, he learned how to do that better. And he also changed some of his own practices. And so I really admire Fauci for his ability to listen and change. The idolization of Fauci, I think, is somebody who is not playing politics, who is trying to tell us, give us the lowdown on what's going on, willing to tell us what he doesn't know and when he doesn't know. And we need information from someone because we cannot trust the commander-in-chief to give us proper information or tell us what we need to do that's best for us. And the CDC has gotten politicized, the FDA has gotten politicized. Fauci's the one person or one of the few people who has the experience, has the knowledge, and is trying to communicate it. Do I think a humanist would be in that position? No. But to be fair, the information we need right now is from the expertise that Fauci has, and it's not humanist expertise. Could Fauci use people who can help him communicate more effectively? He certainly could have during the HIV pandemic, and I think he's learned that, and I think he is communicating more effectively. And again, think about Letterberg, an immunologist, telling us we need to change our metaphors. These people are listening to us. It takes time, but they're listening, and we have to learn to speak their language as well. We have to learn how to explain so that not just other academics can understand why looking at metaphors and looking at language and looking at narratives is so important to medical outcomes. The outbreak narrative affects survival rates. It's the way we communicate, the way we learn how we address something, that's going to affect who lives and dies. We have seen that in COVID. And that's what we need to show and explain in order for people to start listening.
Could I ask a follow-up thing? Because I wanna go back to the humanists in that position. Maybe not the humanists in that position, but why not have a humanist on the panel?
Oh, yeah.
As a part of the group.
No,
And one of my frustrations with the way that the institutes of health understand or engage in public health research is that they don't have humanists.
Right.
The humanistic and other kinds of knowledge production operate totally outside of the institute. But human beings engage in humanist knowledge all the time, And it has such an impact on how we not only understand epidemics and pandemics and our relationship to it, but how we live.
Absolutely.
And so it just seems like there's this constant thing where we're spinning our wheels because we're not only not changing our metaphors, we're not changing our methods.
100%. I mean, thank you for the corrective, because I certainly don't mean to say humanists should not be central to this conversation. My students once made me a t-shirt that said, if you change the story, you can change the world, because that's my mantra. And, or you begin to change the world. Muriel Rukeyser, the universe is made of stories, not atoms, and I even pushed back and said, well, it's both. And of course, I'm a materialist. But somebody pointed out to me, but atoms are theories. We still know atoms through naming and narratives and all of those things. Absolutely, we know the world that way. And if we don't address how we are telling these stories and how we think about it, I mean, that's everything I'm trying to say. We're not going to change our practices. We're going to keep doing the same thing. One of the things, and I work a lot in genomics as well, and one of the things that I tell scientists is, if you step back and learn to analyze how you are talking about your experiments, you may find yourself unblocking something you're blocked on. You may find that you can change your perspective on your experiment because suddenly you've seen an assumption you're making that is in your way. And that's everything I'm trying to say. You put it beautifully. I shouldn't have repeated it because you said it all. So thank you for the for the corrective. Yes.
Thank you for your answer.
We have a lot of really excellent questions here, so I'm going to jump in with another one. In that sort of intersectional place that is defining how we think about the virus, somebody wanted to know about gender inequities and how they play into that, into the narrative, and whether or not you've noticed patterns that we should be aware of and be looking for.
Yes, absolutely. Gender, I mean, you can't talk about race without gender, gender without race, right? These are all completely, and sexuality, these are overlapping terms. And if you think about what populations are living under the poverty line, they tend to be racialized, gendered, I mean, consistently. So both of those terms, I mean, I really emphasized race And I apologize, I should have really made more clear that it's a both and. Yeah, I mean.
That's great. We did have a question that's sort of about the histories of scapegoating. You mentioned scapegoating, but then you couldn't get into it. The person who asked the question referred to the bubonic plague, but also the Spanish flu, right? Mm-hmm. And so maybe if you could comment a little bit on scapegoating and how.
Yeah, I mean, the French used to refer to VD as, I can't remember, was it the English disease, the something disease, and the English referred to it as the French disease. Let me answer that a little bit indirectly by taking us to COVID, and not just the racial scapegoating, but although it's implicit in this, if you think about who people consider safe enough to let into their houses, right? Or to be in contact with, or to take their masks off with. One of the things I've noticed is the more you trust someone, and you could say, okay, the more I trust someone, the more I know that they would tell me if they were doing X, Y, and Z, and I can trust. That's true, but we're all going shopping, and we're all going to, and I mean grocery shopping, and we're all going to doctor's appointments, and we're all, we are being exposed in ways we don't know. Somehow or another, the closer someone is to you, both in, and if you think family group, maybe religious communities, maybe expanding that to, whatever community you identify with, we somehow feel that those people are safe, that they can't make us sick. Whereas no matter how much someone has been sheltering, when they come from a group that's farther, that's someone we consider more of a, quote, stranger, we're afraid to let them in, even if we know for a fact that they have been sheltering in place. And I've just noticed that anecdotally in my circles. And I think that's an example, if you write that large onto, national cultures or populations, you will see how racialized that is. Racial groups, religious groups, etc., but especially racialized. So an example from the last SARS pandemic in North Carolina, a friend of mine in North Carolina stopped going to the florist that she'd been going to for 25 years in the last SARS pandemic in 2002, 2003, because she was Chinese. And I said to her, you've been going to this woman for 25 years. Why do you think you can't? And she knew it was irrational, but she couldn't make herself do it. And that's the point I was trying to make with the Barbara Culleton example, and also with the notion of microbes as illegal immigrants or terrorists, right? Those are racialized terms in our culture. And it racializes the microbe, and it makes us do things we're not supposed to do. Or even some of us, yeah, I've said it. I don't know how to end that sentence.
But I mean, so how do we combat, what narratives do we put in place to I don't want to use the combat, but what narratives do we put in place that replace those, those are unconscious, right? So how do we address that in our current moment? How do we?
Yeah, I mean, that's why I do the kind of analysis I do, where I even look at my own language, because, and my own reactions, because the fact that I can work on the outbreak narrative, I can know that this thing was inevitable, not if, but when, right? I know this, and yet I'm surprised when it happens. And I was telling people, oh no, this will be contained, this will be contained. I can't believe I fell victim to the outbreak narrative. And I listen to myself all the time, just as you did, using these metaphors. And so I think it's using our, in my case, literary critic, but other humanistic skills, humanities skills, using my skills as a literary critic to analyze all the information that's coming in, and even in my own writing to go back and look at, my own biases. We are all biased. We are living in a biased world, right? All kinds of biases. So the only way to do it is to keep digging, to keep listening to ourselves, and also to have this conversation with as many people as possible, not from your own world, across disciplines, across fields, across populations, everything. For me, listening to the Black Lives Matter analysis and going, yes, absolutely. If we address anti-Black violence by the police and we keep following the trail, we will get to all of the structural inequities like healthcare that should be universal access. We should have universal access to healthcare as a basic right. All of that, we will be led there.
Okay. All right. I think we should probably, we have one more minute, but that's not enough time. So
Sorry,
no, that's a great place to end.
Yes.
We should address these and bring them with us into the post-pandemic world, address these inequalities and structural biases. I think it's a great place to end. So thank you so much.
Thank
Marlon,
you so much. And thank you.
Priscilla,
Thank you all for the questions. Those were great questions.
and thank you so much for coming. And we hope to see you in the other events in this series.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Take care.